I actually checked. There is no time in Europe's history when the security architecture of its own continent was decided by outside powers without anyone from Europe at the table, which is what's happening right now between, the Trump administration and Russia in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. That's never happened.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I've got again the fantastic Arnaud Bertrand with me, one of Twitter X's best and most profound political analysts. I recommend everybody subscribe to Arnaud as he really hits the nail on the head every single time. He does fantastic current affairs and fantastic data analysis. Arnaud, welcome back to the channel.
Thank you again for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here, Pascal.
We're glad to have you here to give us a update on all the things that are happening with light speed compared to the last 3 years when it comes to peace negotiations between Russia and the United States. We are talking today on February 19th, and the first meeting between Lavrov and Rubio just happened. Could you tell us the other things that are important to keep in mind that are going on around us right now?
Sure. I mean, there is so much going on with the new Trump administration that it's just making a list of what happened in 1 month is going to take hours. I think one of the first things I tweeted about when the new Trump administration started were some declarations by Rubio, which really stood out from previous U.S. administration, which was him recognizing the existence of the multipolar world order. He clearly said that we are in a multipolar world, which I don't think any U.S. official, especially so senior, had ever said before that. The Biden administration was all about clinging to the previous order. So that new administration really differs in that they recognize that the previous order is just gone, right? It's a multipolar world now, and what he also said is that not only the previous order had disappeared, but its features needed to be completely changed because I think the language that he used was that those features were being weaponized against the US. The previous order had become a weapon. So the US has gone from really the country that created the previous order to now a country that sees it as a weapon used against it and seeks to completely change it. So it's quite an incredible shift. And then of course you had I mean, let's jump directly to what's happening in Europe right now. You had J.D. Vance's incredible speech at the Munich Security Conference, basically giving a big sermon to Europeans, announcing, we basically don't share your values anymore. Like we don't recognize you. That's not who we are. We are ideologically different from you guys, which is also incredible because it's sort of enacts the end of the Western Alliance, which was a key feature of the world since World War II.
Although it's very important to recognize that what Vance said was that we, the United States, we are sticking to our guns, right? We are sticking to democracy, plurality, freedom of speech, and so on. While what you have been doing in reality is you've been restricting democracy, you've been restricting freedom of speech, you've been restricting all of these values that we hold dear, even though you proclaim that you're for those, right? So Vance kind of put a mirror in front of their faces.
Yeah, but it's extremely hypocritical because why did Europe become this way? It's by following the US, right? So one example that he gave in his speech was that of Romania.
Mhm.
As you remember, there were elections in Romania, and then the people voted for a far-right candidate, and those elections were annulled because of Russian interference in social media on TikTok. And the US was the first one to cheer that. I actually found the statement by the US State Department, which predates any statement by the EU. So it led that cheering of an annulment of elections based on a lie, because it was proven after that it was a lie. Those Russian that Russian interference on TikTok was actually paid for by the candidate that lost, the Romanian candidate, well, the party of the Romanian candidate that lost. So it was, something happening inside Romania. It had nothing to do with Russia. Um, and so the US led that, the Europeans follow, and for a lot of what Vance was criticizing Europe for, it was a lot of it was what the US did as well, and often led Europe to do. Right, so it's very convenient for the US to say, to blame Europe for all of that, and it clearly enacts. I mean, we get it. Like the US wants to send a message: we're not like that anymore.
Yeah.
But it's also very hypocritical to put it all on Europe when Europe has been a vassal of the US for quite a few years, and they were just being good vassals in many ways.
Yeah, but that's what happens if you make yourself a vassal and then there's a change
Yeah,
of owner, then don't I mean, again, like this is what you set yourself up to. And
yeah,
this is like why they're so freaking out at the moment, isn't it? But let's continue a little bit. We go into this later, but about the peace negotiations now and the reaction from Europe about this, because we it really seems as if though we are now at a point where it's clearly understood that Russia and the US, both of them want a solution. So the question is only how are we going to solve this diplomatically? But there's no more question if we're going to solve it diplomatically, right?
yeah, yeah. So I mean, clearly, the US wants a solution, and of course, the most important fact here is the exclusion of Europe. Um, I'm not sure exactly why the Trump administration decided to exclude Europe. But typically, when you're not at the table, as the expression goes, you're on the menu. So I suspect that this is why. And we can see that from some of the declarations of US officials, notably around security guarantees to be given to Ukraine afterwards, which I can't remember which official said, but basically the message is it will be mostly the expectation is it will be mostly given by Europeans and not the US, and that's the really costly thing, right? Uh, the security guarantees, putting men on the ground, and then the whole reconstruction of Ukraine. I think the reason why the US is negotiating directly with Russia is so that Europe foots the bill around all of this. And also, Trump has publicly declared that he expects to get his money back from all the spent in Ukraine. On I think it was the Telegraph that published a, a deal proposal between the US and Ukraine on the sharing of the revenue of the natural resources of Ukraine 50-50 going forward. So in effect, the US is trying to, you know, be the one getting reimbursed for its expenses, while Europe had similar, if not bigger, expenses, while all the costs will be uh, borne by Europe.
This is again quite incredible because on the one hand, of course, this was much of what happened because people in the United States pushed for it, right? Victoria
Yeah,
Nuland, Blinken, and so on. On the other hand, the money that the U.S. spent was not money that they just threw out of the window or burned in a furnace. It was money that came straight back into their own military industrial complex, right? It was they propped up their own economy, and even more, all the money, most of the money the Europeans spent also went back there. So this was, and now shifting the narrative into, oh, we wasted so much money, you have to give us more money, is on the one hand absolutely incredible. On the other hand, I mean, this is what politics is. I mean, world politics is. I mean, what else would you expect?
yeah, yeah. I mean, exactly. It's that's been known since the ancient Greeks, right? You had
Thucydides.
Thucydides, who wrote that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know. I mean, it's just a fact. This is the world we live in, and the Europeans can only blame themselves for being dragged into this situation.
And they didn't
Uh,
even get the worst of the entire spiel, right? The worst is suffered by the Ukrainians, who lost all of these now hundreds of thousands, if not, I mean, at least hundreds of thousands of people, ruined for the next 20, 30 years. And now the talk is not on whether you get reconstructed, but who gets your resources, right? I mean, this
yeah.
is like a triple F in a way that is hard to imagine.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. On the amount of reparations, I mean, the very notion that Ukraine will need to pay reparations to the US
Yeah.
is incredible on the face of it, right? Because it's as if it was defeated by the US, that the US is a victor here against Ukraine, which in some way it is. I wrote a tweet around the fact that all proxy wars at the end of the day are a war on two fronts, with one front being against the main enemy, and the other front being against your patron, right? Because he uses you for its own interest and not yours. Ukraine was extremely naive not to see that, to let itself be used this way. And of course, Europe too, incredibly naive because to a lesser extent than Ukraine, of course, is going to have to bear most of the cost while getting absolutely no benefit out of this entire adventure.
What do you think is, from your observation, what are the Russians making out of this? Because they clearly, I would think they see the same things that we see and they have a similar analysis probably. And they will try to make the most out of it, right? Now that you
Yeah,
have a potential, not ally, but somebody who will play with you, and you can finally resolve this goddamn biggest issue at your border, while also still keeping in mind that you have other interests, right? The interest to
yeah,
keep a very good relationship with China, the
yeah.
interest to further BRICS. How do you think the Russians are engaged in this process now?
Uh, well, I was actually thinking about this very question. And I actually think that paradoxically, despite some of the rhetoric, uh, maybe the Russians have the Europeans' interest more at heart
Hmm.
than the Americans, because uh, they've lived themselves through sort of a similar situation, right? Where, I mean, it can be compared with the sort of Sino-Soviet split, right?
Yeah.
What's happening right now? There is an American European split, clearly. They're splitting, but we can see it. Everybody can see it, and that was at the time the Sino-Soviet split was at the expense of the Soviet Union. Ultimately, when after Kissinger went to recognize China, and China joined the the US-led international order, and the Soviet Union was left all alone, and ultimately fell, and had this decade or so of extreme hardship. And I think, I mean, if I were in Russia's shoes, given that Europe is my neighbor, um, I wouldn't want such hardship on them, because it wouldn't be so much in my interest to have, especially given Europe's history of really, of periods of hardship, really, creating a lot of issues, wars, and so on.
Yeah.
So I think the Russians are probably keener students of history. And I wouldn't have, it wouldn't be such a stretch to believe that in the negotiations, they probably think about Europe's interests more than the Trump administration. Because they've lived that, and because they are geographically closer, and therefore more concerned about the potential downsides of really humiliating Europe.
I think you might be right. At least if our assessment um, of Russia's foreign policy analysis and knowledge of history is accurate, and I think that it is, because the other very important parallel would, of course, be the way that Germany was humiliated
Yeah,
in
of course.
1918, right after the First World War, and the Versailles treaties really, really, really squeezed the Germans, and they put all the blame on them, and well, that gave rise to Hitler. And
Yeah,
if Russia would want one thing to prevent, it's another European Hitler from rising, right? So
exactly.
probably that's at their mind, especially because the
Yeah.
Second World War is such an important issue for their national history, right?
Exactly,
Mm.
exactly. And the Americans, as usual, they're very lucky due to their geographical position, right? They
Mm.
are surrounded by two oceans. So even if there is a big mess that occurs in Europe, a war, especially the Trump administration, which seems to really withdraw itself from Europe, it will be less of a concern for them than it will be for Russia.
Do you think that NATO will survive this? Because it seems at the moment, a year ago, it seemed that NATO had never been stronger. And even right now, the calls for, like, getting defense spending to 5%, although that money doesn't go directly to NATO, that's the countries, right? But the NATO still seems pretty sure of itself. But this is, if the peace actually breaks out the way that the US and Russia are working on it, that will be the biggest defeat
Yeah.
for NATO in its history. And plus this constant issue that the United States might leave. Actually, if the Europeans don't play along, if the Europeans try to sabotage, the easiest thing the US can do is to threaten to leave NATO, right? And thereby
Mm.
get them back in line. So do you think NATO will come out positive out of this?
I can't see how, to be honest. So, first of all, there is the proposal that seems to be on the table is that the Europeans will provide a security guarantee in Ukraine, and if there is an issue, if Russia attacks or something, that the US, that NATO, but basically Article 5, will not come into play. That's what I heard. So already that is a significant you know weakening of NATO. De facto, it's NATO with an asterisk, right? There are some situations where Article 5 doesn't come into play if you're attacked by Russia in those conditions. So it already weakens NATO, and NATO is absolutely US led, as we all know. And with the Trump administration, the US being so reluctant to engage itself in Europe, I think like Macron used to say, NATO will become brain dead, effectively. We which I think is a good thing. I've always been I've been an activist around that for years. I think NATO, even De Gaulle at the time recognized it, and that's why he himself left NATO. NATO has always been an instrument of control by the US on Europe, because if you control countries' defense, then you effectively can dictate anything. It's like it becomes a protection bracket, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, if you don't do what I'm asking you to do, then there goes your security. So it was always a big strategic mistake, the biggest strategic mistake on Europe's part, to let itself be protected by the US, because for the very reason that this situation that we are seeing today could arise, where you have a US administration that's completely different ideologically, and that uses that protection racket as leverage against Europe to dictate conditions that are very much not in Europe's interest. So that also should be the key lesson of what's happening right now from a European standpoint, which is to say we need to either throw the US out of NATO, NATO becomes purely a European defense thing, or we build our own army, European army, so we can protect ourselves according to our own interests without depending on anyone else. But so far, the declarations by some European leaders are very worrying, because they don't seem to understand that lesson at all. Like I'm listening to Mark Rutte, who is the Secretary General of NATO, and he's basically yielding on everything. Like, we're going to provide the security guarantees. NATO is going to survive. We're going to do everything to stay united with the Americans. I mean, it's a complete denial of reality, and is not drawing any lesson of what's happening.
I mean, Alex Christoforou put it right when he said that, Mark Rutte, you just need to perceive him as the CEO of NATO, right? He's although he was the leader of the Netherlands, but now he's the CEO of NATO. So
Yeah,
obviously he would say stuff like that, and obviously he will try to sell NATO wherever he can.
yeah.
But the other thing is what the Europeans make out of it, because they do talk now about their own defense and the US not being reliable anymore, right? And there is this argument actually by John Mearsheimer, who in a podcast said that the Russians might actually have an interest in the US staying in NATO to function as an offshore balancer to Europe, because if Europe was completely on its own and had its own army, etc., that might be even more scary to the Russians than having the US connected to it and restraining the Europeans in a sense. What do you make out of that argument? Does that sound logical to you?
Uh, it sounds, yes, it sounds. I mean, it always depends on what is the US administration, right? Because it could go both ways. So if it's Trump, sure, that works. But if it's the Democrat administration that's extremely anti-Russian, then that doesn't work at all anymore, as we've seen with Ukraine. It was not Europeans leading the way with NATO in order to contain Russia. It was exactly the opposite. It was the Americans in NATO that tried to expand it bit by bit all the way to Russia's border. So yeah, I'm actually not sure I completely buy the argument. If you think very short term, sure, but if you think for the long run, I don't think so. And I think that actually Russia probably benefits more from having a divided Western alliance at the end of the day, because when it's just pure logic. When your adversaries are divided, then it's better for you than if they're all united against you. So
Yeah.
yeah, so
Especially if you just won and proved that you can win a war against basically the whole collective, right? Even
yeah,
though it was
yeah,
channeled, but it was the whole collective, and the Russians stood
yeah,
the military test of time, right?
yeah.
So, but do you think if the Europeans decided to take over their own security and to create that the collective armed forces, would they be institutionally able to do that? Because here, this comparison with history, especially with France, is so interesting, because there was an idea to create a European army back in 54 or 55
Yeah.
by the French prime minister at the time, pitched and then negotiated, and at the very end it was the French parliament that sank the idea in 56 or 57, and said, like, no, we're not going to do that, and it never came around. So the question, even in the EU, let's leave out the UK, but the EU, would they be institutionally able to create that? Because it would mean that for the first time you would have a minister of defense, and all EU countries are very scared of giving even more sovereignty into an institution like that.
I mean, there could be different setups
True.
where you could have, purely European armies that would then commit, uh, just like NATO, basically,
Yeah.
right? That would just commit to come to each other's defense in certain scenario. So it doesn't necessarily needs to be a European army. It needs to be, it could also be some sort of alliance, a la NATO, but without the US. I think if you look at it purely from European interests, yes, it makes. I mean, if you think about it logically, it makes perfect sense. If only for economic reasons, because if you look, we spend on that. It's a huge expense, like 2-3% of GDP for. Well, some countries are not there, but that's the type of expenses that we're speaking about, and most of that goes to the U.S. Industry right now. So if we could redirect that to Europe, it's all the better. So if you think in Europe's own interests, yes, it makes plenty of sense for strategic reasons, economic reasons, and so on and so forth. There are different setups that you can have, either, like you said, European army, but there can be questions about sovereignty or alliance and so on. So I think the main issue is not is actually that Europeans don't think in their own interest. That's more the issue, that they've been so used to the status quo of the transatlantic alliance, where security can only be thought as a West thing, and not purely as a European thing, and so on. That that's the main hurdle. So there needs to be an evolution of mindsets, a sort of cultural revolution in the way European elites think, in favor of their own interests. I think that is the main issue.
Do you think we will get that? Because we had it once. I mean, if you look at the success of the conference for the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the CSCE, then that was a high time in the 1970s, right? Between 73 to 75, and in the end, you had like 50 foreign ministers, like having a picture taken, like all the way from Russia to the US, and all the Europeans were part of it. That was when Europe was still divided. You had that moment when the Europeans were able to connect their interests to the wider interests of the region, and even the very broad region. So it seems at the moment they're unable to do so. But what is your hinge on whether the current, I mean, the cold water that's being poured over Europe right now, is that going to
Mm.
wake them up or not?
I think the current crop of leaders are beyond hope, unfortunately. But as the saying goes, good times create weak men create hard times, and the hard times create strong men, right? So we are entering the hard times. And unfortunately, I think it's going to last a while. I've often said that Europe is entering its own century of humiliation. And we are about to have an probably unprecedented humiliation. I actually checked. There is no time in Europe's history when the security architecture of its own continent was decided by outside powers without anyone from Europe at the table, which is what's happening right now between, the Trump administration and Russia in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. That's never happened. Like even Yalta, which is often, considered quite strategically bad for Europe. Churchill was there. Churchill was at the table. So yeah, that's never happened. It's an unprecedented humiliation. So yeah, we're gonna suffer through the consequences of that. Um, Hopefully, ultimately, a wiser crop of leader is gonna emerge out of that. And that's also the silver lining of Vance's speech, of the Trump administration's attitude towards Europe. It's it's gonna make a lot of people realize that the world has changed, that the end of history is over, and that Europe needs to finally wake up and adapt to the world it lives in. But those things take time. You need to change the curriculums in international relations universities, or all those schools like Sciences Po in France that educates the future crops of leaders. I mean, it takes a long time for those types of ideas to seep in. So yeah, it's not gonna happen soon. I don't think so.